The airport lights buzzed overhead while families laughed and counted down to midnight somewhere beyond the glass walls, but I was 16 years old, sitting alone on a cold metal bench at Gate B12, starving, shaking, and slowly realizing that the people who were supposed to protect me had just abandoned me. The terminal of Atlanta's massive airport was alive with movement even as evening settled into night. Suitcases rolled across polished floors, children clung to stuffed animals, and couples leaned into each other with the comfortable warmth of belonging. I watched them from the corner where I had curled against the wall, trying to make myself invisible. My stomach had stopped growling hours earlier. Now it simply ached with a dull emptiness that spread through my chest like a hollow echo. I wrapped my arms tighter around my backpack, the only thing left that was truly mine, and stared at the departure board above the gate counter, replaying the moment my life had shattered. 2 hours earlier, I had walked back from the restroom expecting to see my mother and stepfather waiting exactly where they had told me to meet them. Instead, the seats were empty, the gate area strangely quiet, and the screen above the counter displayed 4 words that seemed impossible to comprehend. Flight 447, departed. I had run to the desk so fast my legs nearly buckled beneath me, my voice cracking as I tried to explain that my family was still supposed to be there. The airline agent typed into her computer, frowned, and calmly informed me that Victoria Carter and Leonard Ashford had already boarded the plane 20 minutes earlier. When I insisted that I had been told to wait only a few minutes, she delivered the explanation that still rang in my ears. They said you changed your mind and decided to stay behind. At first, my brain refused to accept it. My hands shook as I searched through my backpack, convinced that my phone or wallet must still be inside somewhere. Instead, I found nothing except a spare shirt, a toothbrush, and my small journal. My phone was gone. My wallet was gone. Even the emergency money I had hidden inside the lining of my bag had disappeared. It took only a moment for the memory to surface. My mother had walked back to my seat during the flight earlier that afternoon, smiling sweetly and asking if I needed anything. I had gone to the bathroom while she stood beside my seat, 3 minutes. That was all it took for her to take everything. Once the realization settled in, the panic came rushing like a tidal wave. I waited in a long line at the customer service counter, rehearsing the explanation over and over in my head, praying that someone would believe me. When it was finally my turn, I blurted the words out in one breath. I'm 16. My parents left me here. They took my phone and money, and I don't know what to do. The tired woman behind the counter asked calmly if I had identification. I shook my head. She asked if I had a number they could call. I gave her my mother's phone number. She dialed, listened for several seconds, and then told me the number was no longer in service. The look she exchanged with her coworker was the same look I had seen my entire life. The silent assumption that I was exaggerating, that I was dramatic, that I was the difficult child my stepfather always claimed I was. A supervisor arrived, asked me to repeat my story, and stepped away to make a call. When he returned, his expression had hardened into professional distance. The passengers in seats 2A and 2B had confirmed that I chose to remain in Atlanta because I wanted to visit a friend. They had also explained that I had a history of emotional issues and sometimes made impulsive decisions. Before I could protest, 2 airport security officers approached and asked me to follow them. They took me to a small interview room with plastic chairs and bright fluorescent lights where the questions came one after another. Why was I traveling alone? Had I run away from home before? Was I trying to cause trouble for my parents? When the male officer checked his tablet, something changed in his expression, and he informed me that Leonard Ashford had filed a report 3 days earlier warning airport authorities that I might attempt to travel without permission and make false accusations against my family. The trap was perfect. They had planned it before we even left Connecticut. When the officers finally released me back into the terminal, they offered no help beyond a suggestion to contact social services in the morning. The traveler assistance desk would not open until 8 a.m., and the clock on the wall read 7:47 p.m. So I walked back into the terminal alone and found a quiet corner near gate B12 where I could disappear from the world. The crowd slowly thinned as flights departed, and the airport settled into the quiet rhythm of late evening. For the first time since I was 12 years old, I cried without trying to stop myself. I cried for the mother who chose money over her daughter, for the father I had been told died in a plane crash 8 years earlier, and for every moment of my childhood when I believed that if I just behaved better, tried harder, or stayed quieter, maybe my family would finally love me. Eventually, the tears ran dry. The terminal had grown quieter, and I sat staring at the polished floor, too exhausted to think about what would happen next. That was when a shadow fell across my feet. I looked up. I hesitated before taking the sandwich, every warning I had ever heard about strangers echoing in my head. But hunger eventually drowned out fear. The bread was slightly crushed, and the peanut butter unevenly spread, yet it tasted better than anything I could remember eating in months. The man did not sit beside me immediately. Instead, he lowered himself onto a nearby bench a few feet away, giving me space as if he understood exactly how fragile trust could be. After a moment, he said quietly, "My name's Samuel Grant. I used to work at this airport a long time ago, and tonight I've been watching you sit here wondering if someone would notice." I wiped my face with my sleeve, embarrassed by the dried tear tracks on my cheeks. "Why would you watch me?" I asked cautiously. Samuel studied me for several seconds before answering. "Because you remind me of someone I failed once, and I promised myself that if I ever saw another kid looking that lost, I wouldn't walk away again." His voice carried a weight that felt genuine, not rehearsed, and something inside me softened despite my instincts. Still, suspicion lingered. "You don't know me," I said. "You don't know what happened." Samuel leaned back against the pillar, folding his hands over his worn jacket. "Maybe not," he replied, "but I know abandonment when I see it." For a few minutes, neither of us spoke while travelers drifted past in the distance, their conversations blending into the dull hum of the terminal. Finally, Samuel asked, "What's your name?" I hesitated before answering. "Emily Carter." The moment the words left my mouth, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. He did not react dramatically, but his eyes narrowed with quiet recognition. "Emily Carter," he repeated slowly, as if testing the sound of it. "That's interesting." I frowned. "Why?" Samuel exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. "Because your name has been circulating around this airport for years in ways you probably don't understand yet." My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering immediately, Samuel stood and extended a hand toward me. "Come with me for a minute. I want to check something." My instincts flared again, but curiosity and desperation overpowered them. I followed him down the corridor to a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." He knocked in a specific pattern, 3 quick taps followed by 2 slower ones, and waited. After a few seconds, the door opened a crack and a woman in an airport uniform peered out. When she saw Samuel, she sighed with familiar exasperation. "Sam, you can't keep showing up here after hours." Samuel gestured toward me. "Angela, I need you to look at this girl's name in the system." The woman's eyes moved to me, and the moment she heard my name, something changed in her face. "Emily Carter?" she repeated quietly. I nodded. Angela Brooks stepped aside and ushered us inside without another word. The small office behind the door was cluttered with monitors and aviation charts, and the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow across her desk as she typed rapidly into her computer. Samuel stood silently beside me while the screen loaded. Then Angela's fingers froze over the keyboard. "Samuel," she whispered, "the flag is real." My stomach tightened. "What flag?" I asked. Angela turned the monitor slightly toward us, though I couldn't fully see the screen. 8 years ago," she said carefully, "someone placed a high-level alert across several airline databases. It's not a security threat alert, it's more like a watch notice. It says if Emily Carter ever appears in the system, contact Priority Level 1 immediately." "Priority 1," I echoed. Samuel crossed his arms slowly. "Who placed the alert?" Angela scrolled through another window, frowning. "It's restricted access, but the name attached to the directive is someone very powerful." My pulse hammered in my ears. "Who?" Angela hesitated before answering. "The chairman of Sky Atlantic Airlines." The words meant nothing to me at first, but Samuel reacted instantly. "That's impossible," he muttered. Angela shook her head. "Not impossible. The alert was placed 8 years ago, right after a plane crash investigation connected to the company." Samuel turned toward me, his expression suddenly serious in a way that made my chest tighten. Emily, he said gently, did your father have anything to do with aviation? I swallowed. My mother told me he died in a plane crash when I was 8. The room fell silent. Angela looked from me to Samuel and back again, clearly piecing something together in her mind. Finally, she picked up the phone on her desk. If this alert is legitimate, she said quietly, someone out there has been waiting years to find you. She dialed a number that seemed to bypass several security prompts and spoke briefly before hanging up again. When she turned back toward us, her hands trembled slightly. A car is already on its way, she said. The chairman himself wants to meet her tonight. I stared at her, my mind racing with confusion. Why would someone like that want to see me? Samuel answered before Angela could speak, his voice low and thoughtful. Because if I'm right, kid, the story you've been told about your father might not be the truth at all. The words hung in the air long after Samuel spoke them, echoing through my mind in a way that felt impossible to process. My father had died when I was 8 years old. That was the only version of reality I had ever known. My mother had told me the story herself, sitting stiffly across from me in our living room, explaining that his private plane had crashed into the ocean during a business trip and that there had been no survivors. There had been no funeral because there was no body to bury, and although I had asked questions for years afterward, the answers had always been the same quiet sentence. Sometimes the ocean keeps what it takes. Now Samuel was suggesting that the entire story might have been a lie. Angela Brooks watched my expression carefully as the silence stretched between us. Finally, she gestured toward a chair beside her desk. Emily, you should sit down, she said gently. I obeyed without thinking, my legs suddenly unsteady beneath me. Samuel leaned against the wall nearby, his arms folded while he studied the floor as though replaying memories from years earlier. After a moment, Angela cleared her throat. The alert in our system was created 8 years ago under a directive signed by the chairman of Sky Atlantic Airlines. That's a massive company, one of the largest carriers in the country, and whoever issued that order wanted every airport connected to their network to watch for your name. They didn't flag you as a threat or a runaway. They flagged you as someone who needed to be found immediately. I shook my head slowly, struggling to follow the logic. But why? I'm nobody. I'm just a kid whose parents left her at an airport. Samuel pushed away from the wall and crouched slightly so he could look at me at eye level. Maybe you're not nobody, he said quietly. Maybe someone powerful has been searching for you for a very long time. His words stirred something distant in my memory, a faint echo of my father's voice reading bedtime stories long ago, but the connection still felt too fragile to believe. Angela glanced at the clock mounted above her door. Whoever requested the alert is about 40 minutes away, she explained. Their office confirmed they're sending a car from the private terminal. My confusion deepened. Private terminal? Angela nodded. The chairman doesn't travel through the public gates. People at that level usually fly their own aircraft. Samuel rubbed his beard thoughtfully. Angela, if this is who I think it is, we might be reopening something that was buried a long time ago. She looked at him sharply. You're talking about the Mitchell crash investigation, aren't you? Samuel didn't answer right away, but his silence was enough. My pulse quickened. What investigation? I asked. Angela and Samuel exchanged a look before Angela sighed and turned back to her computer screen. 8 years ago, there was a private jet crash connected to Sky Atlantic, she said slowly. It was officially ruled an accident caused by mechanical failure, but some people inside the company suspected there was more to it. The investigation disappeared almost overnight. Samuel's jaw tightened. Because the people responsible had the power to make it disappear. I stared at him. Responsible for what? Samuel hesitated, as though choosing his words carefully. Responsible for sabotaging that plane. The room seemed to tilt slightly around me. Are you saying someone murdered my father? I whispered. Angela shook her head quickly. We don't know that, she said, though the uncertainty in her voice betrayed her. Samuel exhaled slowly. All I know is that the crash destroyed more than one life. I worked as a maintenance supervisor for Sky Atlantic back then. When the investigators needed someone to blame, they pinned it on me. The confession stunned me. You, Samuel nodded. They claimed I falsified safety inspections and cleared a plane that shouldn't have flown. I lost my job, my reputation, and almost a year of my life in prison. By the time I got out, everything I'd built was gone. He gave a faint shrug. So I stayed here at the airport. It was the only place left that still felt familiar. I glanced at his worn jacket and suddenly understood the quiet dignity behind his rough appearance. Angela tapped her keyboard again and looked up with renewed urgency. "The car just checked in with security," she said. "They're pulling up to the executive entrance now." My heart began pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Samuel straightened, his expression suddenly serious. "Emily," he said softly, "whoever is about to walk through that door has spent 8 years trying to find you. I think you deserve to hear what they have to say." I stared toward the hallway outside Angela's office, every emotion inside me colliding at once: fear, disbelief, anger, and a fragile spark of hope that felt almost too dangerous to hold. 8 years ago, my life had shattered when my father's plane disappeared into the sky and never returned. Now, somewhere in the airport beyond those walls, a man powerful enough to command an entire airline was arriving to meet me, and the quiet certainty growing in my chest told me that whatever happened next would change the truth of my past forever. The next 20 minutes passed with the strange elasticity of time that comes when a life is about to change forever. I sat in Angela Brooks's cramped office listening to the distant sounds of the airport, while my thoughts spiraled in endless circles. My father had died 8 years ago. That was the truth I had grown up with, the foundation beneath every memory of my childhood after that day. Yet Samuel Grant stood quietly beside the desk with the posture of a man who believed something entirely different. Every few moments, Angela checked her computer screen or glanced toward the hallway, her movements quick and tense as if she knew the person about to arrive carried more weight than an ordinary visitor. Eventually, the quiet hum of activity outside the office changed. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, measured and purposeful. Angela straightened in her chair, Samuel pushed away from the wall, and I felt my heartbeat thundering in my chest. A knock sounded against the doorframe before it opened. 2 men in dark suits entered first, scanning the room with practiced caution before stepping aside. Behind them walked another man, older than I expected, perhaps in his early 50s, with dark hair threaded with gray at the temples. His posture was confident but not arrogant, the calm authority of someone used to being obeyed without raising his voice. The moment his eyes found mine, he stopped moving entirely. For several seconds, no one spoke. The room seemed to shrink around us as the stranger stared at me with an expression that looked like shock wrapped in something deeper, something painfully familiar. I noticed the way his jaw trembled slightly as though he were holding back words too large to speak all at once. Finally, he took a single cautious step forward and said my name, not loudly but with the fragile certainty of someone who had repeated it in their mind thousands of times. "Emily." My breath caught in my throat. That voice. I hadn't heard it in 8 years, yet my mind recognized the sound instantly the way a child recognizes the melody of a lullaby. Memories flooded back in flashes, bedtime stories, the smell of coffee in the morning, strong arms lifting me onto broad shoulders. I felt my knees weaken as I whispered the word I had not spoken since I was 8 years old. "Dad?" The man closed the distance between us in 3 hurried steps and pulled me into an embrace that felt both desperate and impossibly gentle. His arms wrapped around me as if he feared I might disappear again if he loosened his grip even slightly. "I thought you were gone," he murmured into my hair, his voice breaking. "For 8 years I thought I lost you." My mind struggled to reconcile the impossible reality of the moment. I pulled back enough to look at his face. The lines around his eyes were deeper than I remembered, the gray hair new, but the eyes themselves were unmistakable, clear blue, exactly like mine. "Mom said you died in the crash," I said, my voice trembling. My father, Daniel Carter, closed his eyes briefly before answering. "Your mother told me the same thing about you. When I woke up from the coma after the crash, she told me you had been killed in a car accident while I was unconscious. She even gave me a death certificate." The room fell silent again as the truth settled over us like a heavy fog. Angela Brooks lowered herself slowly into her chair, while Samuel stared at the floor with a grim expression that suggested he had feared something like this all along. My father continued speaking quietly, as though explaining a nightmare he had spent years trying to wake from. "For 6 years I believed you were gone. Then a private investigator discovered that the death certificate was forged. By that time, your mother had already moved across the country with a new identity and disappeared with you. His hands trembled slightly as he reached up and brushed a strand of hair from my face, as though confirming that I was truly there. I searched everywhere, he continued. Different schools, different cities, false records. Every time we got close, she vanished again. Eventually, I placed alerts in every major airline system in the country in case you ever traveled under your real name. Angela nodded quietly, confirming his explanation. That's the alert we saw tonight, she said. The moment Emily's name appeared in the database, the system triggered your notification. My mind reeled with the scale of what he was describing. 8 years of searching. 8 years of believing we had each lost the other forever. Why would she lie like that? I asked, though the question already carried its own terrible answer. My father's expression hardened with the quiet anger of someone who had carried betrayal for a long time. Because she and Leonard Ashford were involved in something far worse than divorce, he said slowly. They sabotaged the plane that day. The crash wasn't an accident. The words struck me like a physical blow. They tried to kill you? My father nodded once, his eyes dark. And when I survived, they needed a way to make sure neither of us could ever expose them. Samuel stepped forward then, finally speaking again. Which means abandoning Emily tonight wasn't just cruelty, he said gravely. It was the final step of a plan to erase the last witness. I stared at the 3 adults surrounding me, people who now shared the same grim understanding, and felt a cold realization spread through my chest. My mother and stepfather hadn't simply left me behind because they didn't want me anymore. They had abandoned me because they believed I was the final loose end in a conspiracy that had begun 8 years earlier. And now, standing in a small office inside an airport terminal, the truth that had been buried for nearly a decade was finally beginning to surface. For several minutes after my father revealed the truth about the crash, none of us moved. The small office suddenly felt too quiet, as if the weight of 8 years of lies had filled the space between us. My mind struggled to keep up with everything that had just been said. My mother had told me my father was dead. My father had been told that I was dead. Both of us had spent nearly a decade grieving each other while the 2 people responsible for the tragedy built new lives on the wreckage. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like cold water seeping through the cracks of something that had been broken for years. My father eventually guided me into the chair beside Angela's desk, never letting go of my hand. His grip was warm and steady, a quiet reassurance that he wasn't going to disappear the way my childhood memories had warned me he might. Emily, he said gently, I know this is overwhelming, but there are things you deserve to understand tonight. I nodded weakly, though my thoughts still felt scattered. Angela pushed her chair back and crossed the room to shut the office door, lowering her voice once it clicked closed. Daniel, if Leonard Ashford is involved in this, the authorities need to know immediately, she said. The crash investigation was buried, but attempted murder and fraud on this scale can't stay hidden forever. Samuel Grant leaned forward against the edge of the desk, his weathered face carrying the quiet intensity of someone who had waited years for this moment. The problem, he said, is that Leonard has spent a decade covering his tracks. People like him don't just leave evidence lying around. My father gave a slow nod. He's right, he admitted. Leonard wasn't just my chief financial officer at Sky Atlantic. He controlled the company's entire accounting structure. When the crash happened, he used those connections to bury every suspicious detail before investigators could dig deeper. The conversation made my chest tighten with a mixture of anger and disbelief. So they tried to kill you, I said quietly, looking at my father, and then they lied about my death so no one would question anything. My father's expression softened with sadness as he squeezed my hand. They needed control, he explained. Control of the company, control of the money, and control of the narrative. If the world believed both of us were gone, there would be no one left to challenge them. Angela turned back to her computer, pulling up several records on the screen. That theory fits the financial data, she said after a moment. Large transfers from Daniel's accounts began shortly after the crash, and the trust fund created for Emily has been steadily drained over the past 8 years. My stomach twisted. My trust fund. My father looked at me carefully, as though deciding how much truth I was ready to hear. When you were born, he said, I set aside $12 million in a trust for your future. Your mother was named the trustee until you turned 18. The number sounded unreal, almost absurd. I had spent years living under Leonard Ashford's strict rules, rarely allowed to buy new clothes or attend school activities because they were supposedly too expensive. But we barely spent anything, I said. Leonard always said money was tight. Samuel let out a short, humorless laugh. Money wasn't tight, he said. It was disappearing. Angela tapped another key on her keyboard and rotated the monitor slightly so we could see the figures scrolling across the screen. Over $4 million have been withdrawn from that trust account, she said. Most of it routed through shell companies tied to Leonard Ashford. My father's jaw tightened as he studied the numbers. Beach properties, luxury vehicles, offshore accounts, he muttered. They weren't just covering up the crash, they were stealing Emily's future while they did it. The realization burned like acid in my chest. My mother hadn't simply abandoned me at the airport because she didn't care about me anymore. She had done it because I was the final barrier between them and the last of the money they were stealing. So leaving me behind tonight, I whispered. Samuel finished the thought quietly. Was their way of making sure you'd never reach 18 to claim what was yours. Silence returned again, heavier than before. My father finally stood and walked slowly to the window, staring out at the dim runway lights in the distance. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new firmness that hadn't been there earlier. This ends tonight, he said. Victoria and Leonard think Emily is alone and helpless. They believe their plan worked. He turned back toward us, his eyes steady. They have no idea we've just uncovered everything. Angela nodded. If we contact federal investigators now, they can intercept them before they leave the country, she said. But we'll need cooperation from the airline to track their travel records. My father gave a faint smile that carried both exhaustion and resolve. That won't be a problem, he replied. As of 3 years ago, I reacquired controlling interest in Sky Atlantic. I blinked in surprise. You run the company again? He nodded. I rebuilt it from nothing after the crash. Every mile I traveled, every deal I made was part of one goal, finding you. The quiet determination in his voice made something inside my chest loosen for the first time since the nightmare had begun. I had spent 8 years believing my father had vanished from the world, yet he had been searching for me every single day. My father returned to my side then and rested a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Emily, he said softly, tonight we finally end the lies your mother started, but we're going to do it together. As Angela reached for the phone to contact federal agents and Samuel stepped closer to the door, I realized that the long nightmare my mother had created was finally unraveling. The truth that had been hidden for nearly a decade was about to surface, and when it did, the people who tried to erase our lives were going to face consequences they never imagined. Within the hour, everything began moving faster than my mind could process. Angela Brooks contacted federal investigators. My father made a series of calls that seemed to set entire departments of the airline into motion, and Samuel Grant remained quietly near the doorway like a silent witness to the moment he had waited years to see unfold. Outside the office window, the airport lights glowed against the night sky, but inside the small room, the atmosphere had shifted from shock to purpose. For the first time since I had collapsed onto that bench at Gate B12 earlier in the evening, I no longer felt like a lost teenager abandoned in a crowded terminal. I felt like someone standing at the edge of a truth powerful enough to change everything. An hour later, we were escorted through a secure corridor toward the executive terminal on the far side of the airport. The hallway smelled faintly of jet fuel and disinfectant, the hum of distant engines vibrating through the walls. My father walked beside me the entire time, never more than half a step away, as though the years he had lost searching for me had turned into an instinct to keep me constantly within reach. When the corridor opened into a glass-walled lounge overlooking the private runway, 2 federal agents were already waiting beside a large screen displaying live airport traffic. One of them introduced herself as Special Agent Rivera and explained the situation in calm, efficient terms. Your mother and Leonard Ashford landed in Los Angeles earlier this evening, she said while pointing at the map glowing across the monitor. They checked into a hotel near the international terminal and booked a private transfer for an early morning flight to Switzerland. Samuel crossed his arms beside me, his brow furrowing. Switzerland, he asked. Agent Rivera nodded. Geneva specifically. We believe they were planning to send Emily to a private boarding facility there. My father's expression hardened instantly. That was never a boarding school, he said quietly. It was a place where inconvenient children disappear. The words chilled the room. Angela inhaled sharply while the agents exchanged grim looks. Rivera tapped the keyboard again and brought up another window filled with financial records. We've been investigating that facility for years, she explained. Families with significant wealth sometimes use it to isolate heirs who might interfere with their financial plans. Your mother and Leonard Ashford appear to have been coordinating with them for months. I felt a slow wave of nausea rise through my chest. So the plan was to send me there, I whispered. Samuel nodded grimly. And once you were gone, no one would ever question where the rest of your trust fund went. My father turned toward Agent Rivera with a quiet intensity that made the room feel suddenly smaller. How soon can we intercept them? He asked. Rivera glanced at the clock mounted above the doorway. They're scheduled to board their international flight at 6 a.m. If we move now, we can reach Los Angeles before they leave the airport. The answer hung in the air for only a second before my father nodded. Then we leave immediately. The next half hour passed in a blur of movement. Security teams escorted us across the dark tarmac to a sleek private jet waiting beneath a row of floodlights. The aircraft bore the Sky Atlantic logo across its tail, the same company my father had once built before it was nearly stolen from him. As we climbed the narrow staircase into the cabin, I paused briefly at the doorway and glanced back toward the endless rows of runway lights stretching into the darkness. Just hours earlier, I had been sitting alone in that airport believing my life had ended. Now I was stepping onto a plane beside the father. I thought I had lost forever. Once the jet lifted into the night sky, the tension inside the cabin settled into a heavy silence broken only by the steady roar of the engines. Samuel sat near the front reviewing documents Angela had printed from the airline database, while Agent Rivera spoke quietly with her colleagues through a secure headset. My father remained across from me, his eyes watching me with a mixture of relief and concern. After a while, he leaned forward slightly and said, "Emily, I know tonight has been overwhelming, but you should know something important." I met his gaze, waiting. Everything they tried to take from us, our lives, our family, your future, we're going to rebuild it together. His words carried the calm certainty of someone who had already spent 8 years fighting to make them true. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of everything that had happened finally begin to settle inside me. The fear and confusion were still there, but beneath them something stronger had begun to grow. The quiet realization that I was no longer alone. Hours later, the lights of Los Angeles appeared beneath the aircraft, stretching across the horizon like a glowing sea of gold. As the plane descended toward the runway, Agent Rivera turned in her seat and spoke with measured confidence. "When we land, federal agents will already have your mother and Leonard Ashford under surveillance. If everything goes according to plan, they'll be taken into custody before they ever reach their flight." My father glanced toward me, his expression steady. "And when that happens," he said softly, "the lies that kept us apart for 8 years finally come to an end." The jet touched down moments later, rolling smoothly across the runway, while the city lights flickered through the windows. Somewhere inside the massive airport ahead of us, my mother still believed she had successfully erased me from her life. She had no idea that the truth she buried for nearly a decade had already caught up to her, and in just a few minutes, she was going to see exactly how wrong she had been. The convoy of black SUVs carried us through the silent service roads of Los Angeles International Airport just before 5 a.m., the sky still dark but beginning to fade toward dawn. Inside the lead vehicle, I sat beside my father while Agent Rivera spoke quietly into a radio, coordinating with teams already positioned throughout the international terminal. The tension in the air felt thick and electric, the kind of silence that forms before something irreversible happens. For 8 years, my mother had controlled every version of my life's story, shaping the truth into whatever served her ambition. In less than an hour, that control was about to collapse. When we entered the terminal through a secured entrance, the airport felt strangely calm, almost empty compared to the chaos of the night before. Early travelers moved slowly through security checkpoints, unaware that a federal operation was unfolding around them. Rivera guided us through a corridor that led toward Gate 67, where the Geneva flight would depart at 6 a.m. Agents already stood scattered through the waiting area, blending into the crowd while watching a single row of seats near the window. I saw my mother immediately. Victoria Carter sat in a polished leather chair beside Leonard Ashford, flipping casually through a travel magazine as if she were waiting for a routine vacation flight instead of fleeing the country after abandoning her daughter 12 hours earlier. Leonard leaned toward her, whispering something that made her laugh softly. The sight made something inside me turn cold. All the fear and confusion that had haunted me since Atlanta dissolved into a clear, steady anger. Agent Rivera gave a small signal and the team moved in. 4 agents approached from different directions, their movements calm and deliberate. Victoria noticed them first. Her smile faded as she looked up and saw the badges. Leonard stiffened beside her. Rivera stepped forward, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to ending games like this. "Victoria Carter and Leonard Ashford," she said evenly, "you are under arrest for wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and child endangerment." For a brief second, Victoria's eyes widened in shock. Then she saw me standing beside my father. The expression on her face changed instantly from surprise to fury. "Emily," she said sharply, as though my presence itself was some kind of betrayal. I stepped forward before anyone could stop me. "You left me in an airport," I said quietly. She straightened, trying to recover her composure while agents secured Leonard beside her. "That was a misunderstanding," she replied quickly, forcing a tight smile. "Leonard and I thought you had changed your mind about traveling with us." The lie sounded so practiced that it might have convinced someone who didn't know the truth, but I did know the truth now. "No," I said, meeting her eyes without hesitation. "You thought leaving me behind would erase the last witness to what you did." Her smile faltered. Behind me, my father stepped forward, his presence alone enough to drain the color from her face. For the first time since I had entered the terminal, Victoria looked genuinely afraid. "Daniel," she whispered. My father's voice was calm but carried a weight that filled the space between them. "You should have finished the job when you sabotaged that plane." The agents began escorting Leonard toward the exit, his protests rising louder as he realized there was no way out. Victoria stood frozen for a moment longer, staring between my father and me as if the reality before her was something she could not fully accept. "You were supposed to stay gone," she muttered bitterly. My father shook his head once. "You spent 8 years trying to erase us," he said quietly. "But truth has a way of surviving." As they led her away, she glanced back at me one last time. The anger in her expression slowly faded into something colder, almost indifferent. "You were always just a means to an end," she said flatly before the agents pushed her forward. I expected the words to hurt the way they once would have. Instead, I felt nothing except the quiet certainty that she no longer had power over my life. Within minutes, both of them were gone, escorted out of the terminal in handcuffs while federal investigators finalized the charges that would keep them in prison for decades. The sun had begun rising beyond the runway, casting the first light of morning across the glass walls of the terminal. I stood there watching it, the weight of the night finally lifting from my chest. My father rested a hand gently on my shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. And for the first time in years, I believed him. 3 months later, I turned 17 in a house surrounded by mountains in Colorado, where the air smelled like pine and the sky felt impossibly wide. Samuel had returned to work as a safety advisor for Sky Atlantic. Angela visited often, and my father had started teaching me how the company worked so that one day I could help lead it. The past would always be part of my story, but it no longer defined the future waiting ahead of me. Sometimes people ask why I chose to tell this story publicly. The answer is simple. For years, I believed I was invisible, that no one would notice if I disappeared. But the truth is that someone was searching for me the entire time. If you've ever felt abandoned, forgotten, or convinced that your voice doesn't matter, remember this. Silence protects the people who hurt us, not the people who survive them. Your story deserves to be heard. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more real stories about resilience, justice, and second chances. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from, because sometimes the simple act of being seen can change someone's entire life.